Rod Stewart, the immortal voice of Maggie May, the untamed fire of "Do You Think I'm Sexy?" is not just a singer. He is a storm made flesh, a force that has roared through the veins of music for more than 60 years. His raspy thunder shook the world's arenas. His velvet roar carried rebellion, love, and heartbreak into the marrow of millions. Knighted for his gift, worshipped across generations, he became more than a man. He became defiance itself. Twice, he was dragged to the edge of the grave. Thyroid cancer ripped away his voice. Prostate cancer nearly stole his life. Yet he rose from the abyss, bleeding but unbroken, singing as though even death must bow to him. But now, as he approaches 80, a darker shadow coils around him, colder, heavier, more merciless than all the storms before. It is the curse that stalks legends in their twilight, a silence waiting to devour the roar, a secret anguish that no stage can drown. What unseen torment grips Rod Stewart's present? Before we begin, don't forget to like and drop a red heart as a gesture of appreciation for his talent. The storms of Rod Stewart's life did not begin on the stage or under the spotlight. They began in the cramped post-war rooms above a modest newsagent at 507 Archway Road, Highgate, where the youngest of 5 in an Anglo-Scottish household first learned that heartbreak can arrive long before applause. Born in January 1945 with an 8-year gap to his nearest sibling, Rod grew up between the steady hands of his Scottish father, Robert Joseph Stewart, once a master builder turned shopkeeper, and his English mother, Elsie Rebecca Gilbert, who held the family together while the bell over the shop door chimed endlessly. Yet inside, amid the hum of customers and the smell of newspapers, the boy often felt a hush too heavy for childhood. The kind of silence that makes dreams feel both fragile and fleeting. School did little to soften the weight. At just 11, he failed the 11+ exam and was sent to William Grimshaw Secondary Modern, a path that seemed to close doors before they even opened. But on the football pitch, he found oxygen. By his mid-teens, he was captaining his school team, pulling on the shirt for Middlesex schoolboys, and imagining himself in the red and white of Arsenal with a pride that made every rainy training session worth the mud. His father, once a semi-pro player and coach, stood proudly at the touchline, whispering faith into the boy's restless heart. Then came the verdict that would scar him for life. In 1961, at just 16, a trial with Brentford ended in silence. No contract, no future, just the crushing truth that he was not good enough. For Rod, it was not merely rejection. It was the death of a first dream, and it left an emptiness more haunting than any song. With football gone, he drifted through odd jobs, screen printing, delivering whatever paid a few shillings, until one grim morning he found himself in Highgate Cemetery, shovel in hand, lowering strangers into the earth. The damp smell of soil clung to his clothes, and years later, he would admit that this was where he learned how cruel time can be, how quickly names vanish from memory. And yet, amid that bleakness, 2 fragile lights remained. One was the intricate world of model railways, tiny empires where every switch and signal obeyed his will, a sense of control the real world denied him. The other was a battered guitar his father bought in 1959, on which Rod fumbled out the mournful chords of an old folk ballad. Discovering that loneliness could be given shape, that despair could be sung, he was not yet the man whose raspy thunder would one day rattle arenas, but the pieces were falling into place. Patience from laying endless tracks, discipline from football training in the rain, defiance from being told no by the one future he wanted most. All of it fused inside him. Reflecting years later, he confessed, not with pride, but with pain, that football had been his first love. But music became his last chance. And you can hear it in every growl and every tender crack of his voice. There is still the echo of a spade cutting into wet earth, the distant toll of a shop bell at closing time, and the boy who refused to be buried by rejection. He did not vanish when the pitch abandoned him. He hardened, carrying loss like a scar, and turned the silence of defeat into the raw current of a voice that simply would not break. proof that sometimes the first real song is born not from triumph, but from the emptiness left behind when a dream dies. At 18, when most boys still chased footballs or first loves, Rod Stewart carried only a harmonica and a guitar with strings that buzzed like unhealed wounds. The boy who once lowered coffins into the earth at Highgate Cemetery now stood at Leicester Square, wiry and restless, his raspy voice cutting through the damp London air. Music was not a choice, it was survival. A last chance after football had slammed its doors. Years later, he would confess almost wistfully, "Football was my first love, music my last chance." And in the gaslight of those streets, every coin tossed into his cap felt less like charity than proof he still existed. They began to call him Rod the Mod in those days, for the spiky hair, the tailored suits, the swagger that tried to hide the ache of being invisible. But behind the bravado was still a boy desperate to be seen. Haunted by the silence that had followed him since Brentford's rejection in 1963, fate cracked open its narrowest window when he joined a small rhythm and blues group called The Dimensions. They were unknown, barely scraping gigs in pubs, but for Rod, each smoky night was a test of endurance. Every sway of strangers' bodies a small victory over anonymity. His voice, raw, wounded, unforgettable, carried something different. But in a city overflowing with sound, standing out was never enough. 3 years later, at 21, the door widened. Jeff Beck, already celebrated as a guitar prodigy, pulled him into the Jeff Beck Group. For the first time, Rod felt the electricity of true stages, amplifiers roaring like thunder, magazines printing his name. It should have been triumph. And, yet, under the fierce brilliance of Beck's solos, he often felt reduced to a shadow. Critics praised his rasp, yes, but always as an appendage. Jeff Beck's singer. In his own memory, he described those years as both a blessing and a curse, and once admitted, "I was there, but I wasn't really there. I was a shadow in someone else's fire." The cruelty of that irony was sharper than Brentford's rejection had ever been. At least football had spat him out clean. Music dangled glory before his eyes, and then chained him to another man's genius. Night after night, he gave his lungs until they burned, but the applause bent toward Beck, leaving him applauded, yet unseen. Success without identity. What could be more heartbreaking? For a boy who had known the silence of graveyards, the taste of being unheard while surrounded by sound was almost unbearable. But within that half-light, something hardened. The humiliation of being just the voice became fuel. Each rejection, each review that named Beck first deepened the vow inside him. He would not remain in the shadow. He would not be remembered as someone else's singer. Somewhere in the ache of his throat, in the stubborn heartbeat of the teenager who once buried strangers, there rose a promise. One day the world would know his name first, his songs first, his story first. And that vow, born in the agony of being overlooked, would become the fire that carried him out of the shadows and into the roar of millions who would one day chant only one name: Rod Stewart. Rod once vowed that no child of his would ever grow up feeling abandoned, that he would never repeat the wound of 1963, and yet here he was again, standing in a courtroom signing. Papers that split his home in two. Unlike Sarah, who had been lost to poverty in youth, Kimberly and Sean were lost to the fracture of fame itself. This wound was crueler because it came when he had everything: wealth, power, recognition, and still failed. He later admitted with quiet anguish, "It's hard to hold it together when the whole world feels like it belongs to you, but your home doesn't." The pain only deepened as years passed. Kimberly grew under the constant glare of celebrity culture, her childhood playing out against the backdrop of tabloid whispers. Sean, the younger son, bore the scars more visibly. As he stumbled into adulthood, he wrestled with addiction, arrests, and repeated attempts at rehabilitation. For Rod, watching his son spiral became a torment far worse than any headline could capture. It was the agony of a father who had once been absent by necessity, now present yet powerless. He had spent decades longing for the chance to be steady, only to find himself staring at the same question. Had he failed his children too? Rod has reflected on these years with brutal honesty. He does not cast himself as hero or villain, but as a man caught between the seduction of fame and the fragility of family. The marriage with Alana had given him 2 children he loved with his whole being. Yet it also carved into him the cruelest of lessons, that love cannot be built on glamour, that the price of broken vows is paid most heavily by the young, and that no spotlight can disguise the silence of a fractured home. This chapter stands as the cruelest paradox of his life. The man adored across continents who could command the voices of millions, but could not keep hold of the smaller, quieter voices within his own house. The world saw the tours, the gold records, the endless charisma. Behind closed doors, Rod Stewart wrestled with guilt, regret, and the unbearable truth that in chasing the roar of millions, he had lost the chance to protect the laughter of his own children. But patterns have a cruel way of repeating. No sooner had Rod endured the heartbreak of divorce than he found himself stepping into another fragile beginning. In the mid-1980s, at 40 years old, he fell in love with Kelly Emberg, a model whose youth, beauty, and warmth seemed to offer what he had been chasing for so long: stability, companionship, and perhaps another chance at building the family life he had lost twice before. In 1987, when Rod was 42, their daughter Ruby was born. Her arrival felt like a spark of hope, an opportunity to finally become the steady father he had promised himself he would one day be. For a time, Ruby's presence softened the chaos that always swirled around him. Photographs from that era capture a gentler Rod. His famously mischievous grin transformed into something quieter as he cradled his infant daughter. He often spoke of how holding Ruby felt like redemption in his arms, a reminder that even amidst the noise of stadiums, the lullabies at home mattered most. With Kelly, their home became not just one of luxury, but of warmth. Breakfast scattered with children's laughter, tiny footsteps chasing across polished floors, the fragile happiness of a family trying to thrive in the glare of celebrity. Yet, just as before, the cracks began to show. Fame was relentless, demanding more tours, more recordings, more nights spent under stage lights instead of at the dinner table. Kelly, though steadfast, lived in the exhausting shadow of Rod's whirlwind existence. By the close of the decade, the weight of separation and strain had eroded their bond, and in 1989, the relationship quietly unraveled. The end was not as explosive as his divorce from Alana, but it was no less painful. For Rod, it meant yet another home dissolved, yet another child growing up in the middle of 2 worlds. What cut deepest was the cruel repetition. "I thought I'd learned," he would admit years later, speaking of Ruby's childhood. "I swore to myself I wouldn't let history repeat, but it did." Once again, despite his devotion, Rod was too often away, torn between the roar of stadiums and the quiet needs of family. Each absence felt like a betrayal of the vow he had carried since 1963, when Sarah had been lost to adoption. He loved Ruby fiercely, but love alone could not fill the silences of absence, nor erase the milestones he missed while chasing immortality in song. For Ruby, the years were a balance of privilege and longing. Raised in the orbit of fame, she later admitted there were times she felt the distance of her father's world. "I knew he loved me," she said in adulthood, "but sometimes it felt like he belonged more to the world than to us." Her words echoed the ache Rod himself carried, that the very gift of his music, the thing that made him beloved, was also the force that so often stole him from those he most wanted to protect. The separation from Kelly and the breaking of Ruby's childhood home became another scar layered upon many. Rod did not disguise the sorrow, nor cast blame. Instead, he spoke of it with weary candor as a man who knew the pattern too well, the pattern of giving himself to millions, while struggling to hold together the fragile permanence of family. For Rod, the hardest role was never the front man, never the global icon, but the simple sacred one, being present, being steady, being a father. And in the quiet shadow of 1989, he once again felt how fragile that role could be. Yet, even in the ashes of broken homes, Rod refused to abandon the hope of love. Having endured the collapse of his marriage to Alana Hamilton and the quiet dissolution of his life with Kelly Emberg, he still carried within him the conviction that somewhere, somehow, he could finally anchor himself. In the dawn of the 1990s, he believed he had found what the world and his own heart had long denied him. Not another fleeting romance, but the promise of forever. In 1990, at 45, Rod Stewart stood at the altar with Rachel Hunter, a 21-year-old, New Zealand supermodel whose beauty seemed untouchable and whose presence felt like salvation. To Rod, their union was more than glamour. It was redemption. He had known the agony of letting go of Sarah, the sting of divorce from Alana, the unraveling of life with Kelly. But with Rachel, he believed the story would change. This time would be different. This time would last. The marriage was a spectacle of its age. A rock legend and a rising supermodel captured on glossy magazine covers and whispered about in the tabloids as a modern fairy tale. Together, they welcomed 2 children, Renee in 1992 and Liam in 1994, whose arrivals filled Rod with the deepest joy. For a man who had once feared he was cursed to repeat loss, holding Renee in his arms, and later Liam seemed like proof that the cycle had finally broken. At last, the family he had dreamed of since youth was not only real, but radiant. For much of the decade, Rod and Rachel seemed invincible. Their photographs, him with his signature blonde mane, her with a grace that seemed otherworldly, were plastered across magazines. Rachel's youth softened Rod's larger-than-life persona, while his devotion grounded her. In their Beverleys, Hill's home, bedtime stories, birthday candles, and poolside laughter seemed to confirm that Rod had finally balanced rock stardom with the ordinary miracle of family. But shadows crept in. The gulf of nearly 25 years between them widened with time. Rod's relentless tours pulled him across oceans, while Rachel, barely into adulthood when they married, began to realize how much of herself had been subsumed by life beside a global idol. What tabloids painted as paradise often concealed loneliness, silence, and growing distance. We were living in 2 different worlds, Rod would later reflect, with a pain that words alone could not contain. 1999, when Rod was 54 and Rachel just 30, the fairy tale collapsed. Rachel walked away. The news stunned not only fans, but Rod himself. For all his earlier heartbreaks, nothing had prepared him for this. He later admitted with devastating simplicity, "I thought she was the one forever. I was wrong." It was. Not merely the end of a marriage. It was the breaking of his last illusion. With Rachel, Rod had truly believed permanence was possible. That the ghosts of 1963, of 1984, of every departure before would finally be laid to rest. Instead, her leaving hollowed him in ways even Sarah's absence had not. Friends recalled him adrift, a man who no longer trusted love. For years, he armored himself against intimacy, haunted by the fear of being left again. The pain echoed beyond. The couple. Renee was only 7, Liam just 5, too young to understand why their parents no longer lived under the same roof. They felt the confusion children always feel in the wake of separation, the sense that something safe had splintered. Later, as adults, they would speak cautiously about those years, acknowledging both the love they received and the ache of growing up in fractured homes. For Rod, this was the cruelest wound of all. To see in his children's eyes the same emptiness he had once carried, despite every vow that history would not repeat itself. Looking back, Rod has spoken of this chapter with candor. He does not paint Rachel as villain or himself as saint. He simply admits that the loss broke him, that for years he wandered through life armored against the very thing he had always chased: love. If Sarah's absence in 1963 had scarred his youth, and Alana's divorce had fractured his prime, then Rachel Hunter's departure in 1999 destroyed his faith itself. It was the moment the eternal romantic stopped believing in romance. And perhaps that is why this chapter stands as the emotional climax of his story. Rod Stewart, the man whose voice filled stadiums, whose name is etched into rock's pantheon, was in the end just a man brought to his knees, not by the roar of fame, but by the silence of a love lost, whispering the simplest, most human confession: that even legends are not immune to the fragility of forever. Inside, fans screamed for encores, never guessing that each chorus was sung against death itself. Every note was not just performance, it was defiance, a prayer clawed out of a failing body. One night, too weak to sleep, he whispered to Penny, his voice breaking, "Not yet. I can't leave them yet. I can't leave you." But even in her arms, comfort was fleeting. What haunted him was not his own death, but the image of Alistair and Aidan growing up without him there, learning to shave, to drive, to live with only echoes of his voice left behind. In 2019, when he finally revealed to the world that he had beaten prostate cancer, it was not a rock star's boast, but a survivor's plea. "I'm in the clear," he said, his voice cracking with relief. It was a message less about himself than about others, urging men to be tested, to face what he had faced, to not let silence kill them. The arena erupted, but for Rod, the triumph was quieter, more sacred, the simple, staggering gift of still being alive. Yet cancer was only one front in the war. Football, his other great love, had carved its own scars. His knees, battered from years on muddy pitches, were replaced with steel. His ankle fused. Every step onto a stage was now a victory snatched from pain. "If I can't perform," he once said, "then I don't know how to live." That was the truth, not vanity but essence. The stage was not work, it was breath itself. And so he fought. Every scar, every hospital dawn, every trembling rehearsal became proof that will could outmatch flesh. The world saw sequins and spotlight. He knew blood tests, radiation burns, and the terror of silence. Looking back, Rod does not speak with bitterness, only humility. "I've been close," he said softly. "Closer than I care to remember. But when you've stared it in the face, when you've thought it could all end, every sunrise feels like a gift." That is why in his later concerts, something in his voice pierced deeper than before. The rasp was no longer only music, it was testimony. It said, "I am still here. I should not be, but I am." For the fans, the songs were nostalgia. For Rod, they were survival stitched into melody. The paradox of his life was sharpest in these years. After decades of heartbreak, he had finally found peace in Penny, laughter in his children, a home that endured. Yet at the very moment he discovered stability, he discovered fragility. Happiness had a price, to wake each day grateful, because each day might be the last. In the end, Rod Stewart emerged not only as a survivor of fame and heartbreak, but of his body's betrayals. His voice, once stolen, still rang. His spirit, once doubting, still soared. And his story, once shadowed by loss, became one of resilience. Proof that even legends bleed, even immortals tremble, and that sometimes the greatest stage is not the arena, but the quiet battle in the night, when a man sings only to remind himself he is still alive. He had beaten cancer twice, endured surgeries that rebuilt his body piece by piece, and stared into the abyss more than once. Yet, as Rod Stewart, Approached 80, he stood not as a man retreating from the stage, but as one still aflame, fragile in body, unbreakable in spirit. For Rod, music was not a profession, or even a calling. It was his bloodstream, his oxygen. To leave the stage would be to surrender life itself. In 2024 and 2025, when most men his age quietly folded into retirement, Rod announced a global tour of 40 shows. The numbers alone staggered. Nearly 80 years old, his voice weathered but still golden in its gravel, his body reconstructed with steel knees and a fused ankle. And yet he was preparing once again to cross oceans, command arenas, and remind the world that the fire had not dimmed. The announcement carried both triumph and tragedy. Triumph because the eternal showman refused to vanish into silence. Tragedy because every performance was now a negotiation with pain, every curtain call a gamble with time. "This will be my last great rock and roll tour," he told the press. His tone equal parts defiance and farewell. But it was not the end of music. Instead, he would turn toward jazz, swing, and the great American songbook, genres that let him bend, linger, and croon rather than roar. It was not surrender. It was adaptation, survival. In 2023, Swing Fever, his joyful collaboration with Jools Holland, had already hinted at that softer future. Brass, rhythm, nostalgia, and the gentler elegance of standards that outlived generations. Yet the shift spoke to something deeper. His body, battered by cancer, surgeries, and decades of reckless living, could no longer keep pace with the violence of rock. But his soul had no concept of retirement. Music. Was not what he did. It was what kept him alive. "I can't stop," he confessed. "I'd wither without it." Behind the curtain, the cost was merciless. Rehearsals drained him. His rebuilt joints protested with every step. His breath shortened. More quickly. His body screamed for rest. Painkillers dulled the sharpest edges, but could not disguise the truth. Every night on stage was not ease, but war. For the fans, the sequins still glittered, the hair still flared, the smile still charmed. But beneath the lights, each move was defiance, each note rebellion against the chains of age. And the cruelest irony was this. The older he grew, the more he understood the true weight of what he was losing. Once he had thought fame meant immortality. Now he knew that even legends bleed, falter, fade. Each encore was no longer a victory lap, but a question whispered into the dark. How many more times? If his career was proof of resilience, his possessions were proof of triumph. By 2025, Rod Stewart's fortune was estimated at $300 million. A lifetime's reward for 50 years of anthems, heartbreak, ballads, and stages conquered. Like many legends of his era, he secured his legacy not only in memory, but in commerce, selling his music catalog for $100 million, turning decades of song into a monument of numbers. To the outside world, it was a final crowning achievement. A man who had sung for generations now ensuring that his voice would echo in vaults of wealth long after he was gone. His home spoke of grandeur. In Beverly Hills, he owned a 60,000 square foot estate valued at $74 million. Its sweeping lawns and palatial rooms, a fortress of celebrity excess, now on the market as if even he knew palaces cannot outlast time. In Essex, England, he kept another grand residence after parting in 2019, with a centuries-old medieval mansion whose stone walls had once carried his laughter. The garages of these estates gleamed like museums. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, a LaFerrari, an Enzo, a Gallardo, each one a sculpture of speed and power, reminders of the man who once lived as fast as he sang. He flew by private jet, sailed in yachts, along Lake Como and Saint-Tropez, indulged in the luxuries that only rock aristocracy could command. Yet behind the splendor lay paradox. "Money can't buy youth or health," he admitted, with unflinching honesty. The mansions could not silence the ache in his rebuilt knees. The Ferraris could not erase the scars carved into his throat by cancer. The yachts could not outrun the image of hospital gowns and trembling nights. To the fans, he was a man of untouchable wealth. To Rod, wealth was a mirror, reflecting not victory, but absence. The larger his fortune grew, the more fragile his peace became. He confessed that castles only made the loneliness grander. Cars sat idle in their garages, collecting dust, while his children's voices became the only true engines of joy. Jets could carry him across oceans, but not back to the days when youth seemed endless. Catalogues could be sold for millions, but not buy him one extra song to sing when breath faltered. Money builds castles, but not permanence, he said. What endured was not marble, nor horsepower, nor contracts. What endured were the hands that held his when illness struck, the faces waiting in the audience when he thought he might not return. There were whispers, too, about his will, his legacy, his division of fortune. He had never made public the split of his empire, but in interviews he hinted that his 8 children would be his truest heirs. Not just the money, but the lessons, that wealth could buy freedom, but not meaning. That luxury was sweetest only when shared with those who loved him before the fame or despite it. What good is a castle, he once mused, if there's no family in its halls? Wealth had given him the means to live like royalty, but royalty was lonely. What he longed for in his 8th decade was not another Ferrari, but more mornings with Penny and the boys. Not another mansion, but the permanence of love. And so, in the twilight of triumph, Rod Stewart carried his fortune not as proof of victory, but as a reminder of what could never be bought. If wealth revealed its shadows, life in the present revealed the light that survived them. Today, Rod divides his time between Beverly Hills and Essex. But it is no longer the mansions that define his home. It is the voices within them. With Penny and their 2 young sons, Alistair and Aidan, he has built the family life that for decades eluded him. The chaos of broken marriages and scattered children has given way to a gentler rhythm. School runs, family dinners, evenings by the pool. For the first time, the rock star became something simpler, rarer, and far more precious. A present father. His 8 children, once divided by distance and divorce, have drawn closer. Illness had forced him to reckon with the years he lost. Now, in his late 70s, he embraces the gift of reconciliation. They visit often, filling his homes with the laughter of grandchildren, with conversations that once might have been left unsaid. The man who once confessed he had been better at writing songs about love than living it has become a patriarch who treasures presence above performance. Yet beneath the domestic warmth, the weight of mortality never loosens. His health remains under constant watch. Doctors monitor him relentlessly for signs of returning cancer. His rebuilt knees and fused ankle remind him with every step that even survival leaves scars. He swims daily, training in water to protect fragile joints, clinging to discipline because indulgence is no longer an option. His diet is meticulous, measured, moderated, stripped of excess. Once the king of champagne nights, he now drinks sparingly, raising his glass with gratitude rather than abandon. The public still sees the golden-haired gentleman in sharp, tailored suits, the eternal rogue of rock aristocracy. But in the quiet of his mirror, the truth cannot be hidden. The creases etched by years, the tremor of exhaustion, the moments when his body whispers what his spirit refuses to hear. That time is finite. And then there is loss. The slow, relentless erosion of his generation. In July 2025, Ozzy Osbourne, his countryman, peer, and fellow survivor of the wildest years of rock, passed away. The news struck Rod not merely as the death of a friend, but as a mirror held to his own fragility. One by one, the giants of his youth were falling, and he was left to stand among their shadows, carrying a torch that flickered ever more alone. "It's strange," he admitted softly, "to be one of the last still standing." No fortune could soften the ache of those absences. The applause of thousands could not fill the silence left at family dinners, when old friends no longer called. When familiar voices were gone forever, Rod had spent a lifetime surrounded by noise, the roar of crowds, the chaos of fame. But now in these years, he discovered that silence could wound deeper than any critic. And yet in that silence there was also clarity. What mattered was no longer the next car, the next house, the next chart. What mattered was the laughter of Alistair and Aidan, the steady presence of Penny, the reconciliation with older children who once felt lost to him. He had learned painfully and completely that time is the only true currency. Every sunrise not guaranteed. Every dinner a gift. Every song a defiance. Rod Stewart in the present is not a man resigned, nor a man untouched. He is a man scarred, softened, and sharpened by age all at once. He carries his wealth as armor, but leans on love as salvation. He sings not because the world demands it, but because silence feels too close to death. And though his body bends beneath the years, his spirit rises with a simple, stubborn vow: to endure, to sing, and to love until the very end. And yet, what a legacy remains. Rod Stewart has sold more than 250 million albums. He has claimed 12 #1 albums and 11 #1 singles. His name is etched permanently in the architecture of popular music. In 2016, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. Sir Rod Stewart at last, a boy once busking for coins, now honored with the highest dignity of his nation. But the statistics, dazzling though they are, do not define him. His truest legacy is not merely the records or awards, but the endurance behind them. The man who lost his voice to cancer and sang again, who nearly lost his life but still strode back onto stage, who faced betrayal by his own body yet refused to let it steal his song. The stage that once overflowed with comrades now stood emptier, making his survival more remarkable. He is not merely a relic of an era, he is its living witness, proof that even as others fall, the flame can still flicker defiantly. Rod Stewart's story is no longer simply one of fame, fortune, and music. It is one of survival, of resilience, of love tested and redeemed. He is a man who built empires of song, lost homes and marriages, nearly lost his own voice, yet still sings. He has stared down cancer, age, and mortality, and still insists on stepping onto stages that could outlast men half his years. And yet, behind the glitter and triumph, a question lingers. Has he truly found peace? Or is he still the eternal wanderer, forever chasing meaning in the lights? Each tour promises farewell, but each curtain call reveals he cannot stop. To leave the stage would be to leave life itself. Perhaps that is why his story feels both triumphant and tragic. For in Rod Stewart, we see the paradox of human desire, the refusal to let go, the yearning to keep singing even when the body whispers surrender. He has wealth, honors, a family who loves him, and still he burns because the music demands it. So now the question passes to us, the audience. Do you believe Rod Stewart should finally lay down his microphone and rest in the arms of family? Or should he keep singing until the very last breath leaves him? If this story has moved you, share it, subscribe, and leave your thoughts. Because in the end, Rod Stewart's journey is not just his own. It is the mirror of all our battles with love, loss, and time.